YouTube, what the crap's going on? HeirofCarthage back in Total War Warhammer. I didn't have time to record very many videos tonight, but wanted to get you a couple of battles that I enjoyed. This one was sent to me by a viewer who said, hey, this is how you defend your stuff as the Dwarfs, and he felt pretty confident about it. So let's see, he's playing up against the vampires. And let's talk a little bit about the vampire build. There's some skeleton warriors, and I believe they are leading some grave guard. Yeah, I believe there's 4 grave guard unit in total. 2 horrors. They have a master necromancer on a barded nightmare, I believe is what this thing's called. And then he's got 2 vargeist. Now, vargeist are cheaper than the vampire cavalry, but they're also a lot flimsier. And you can see this one took a couple of shots from the dwarfs, who have 2 cannons. And their infantry consists of longbeards and dwarf warriors, and dwarf warriors great weapons. Now I'm going to pause it real quick because I want to talk about something. There's some merit to what the dwarf player is doing here. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you right away. The vampire player here has not brought the nastiest vampire army that he could field versus the dwarfs, and he doesn't necessarily play this to what I feel like is the best potential of it, but he does have 3 crypt horrors. Those things are nasty. They can be tough to deal with. He's got a couple of heroes to help pound it out in the fight, and you know, he's got 4 grave guard, which in and of itself are pretty dangerous to the dwarfs. Now that said, there's some things that the dwarf player does here that I very much like. Regardless of the vampire player's pick or play or anything else. One of the things that I want to point out is what he's doing right here. You can see he's got a line of dwarf. Let me come from the above angle here. He's got a line of dwarf warriors here, and he leaves this gap in the lines where he gets a clear line of sight with his thunderers, and he's done the same thing here. So he's got a nice arc of fire out here in front of him. It's not going to be maybe quite the full arc, but you know, something like that. Almost looks like a smiley face. He's got this arc of fire out here covered. And yes, an enemy could try and shoot this gap, but you'll notice that he's keeping a reserve unit right behind it. So this is a pretty nice formation here in the sense that it's going to allow him to fire through cover and still keep this unit somewhat protected. This has the added benefit of just kind of this general area out here in front of the dwarf line. All this stuff is going to be pretty well covered. So any vampire player or any enemy player runs through here is going to be running the gauntlet. They're going to take some damage. And the problem with the vampires is that unless you bring a unit like cavalry, which here they have, it takes a long time to get on the flank. Vampires are slow. And you'll notice that, again, there's still some potential for gaps and stuff over here for him to shoot through. But you'll notice, again, the setup here is front line, what he's got there. He's got a couple of reserve units sitting next to his skirmishers. He's got an anti-large unit sitting in the very middle of the formation, not on the outer edges. And then he's got more units in reserve positions on the flanks and in the rear. So he's got multiple layers to it. And his skirmishers, of course, going to be towards the inside of this. Now, there are some pretty nasty flying death squads out there you're going to run into. The Empire can bring the Empire General on a Griffin. They can bring several Amber Wizards, and then they can spawn several Manticores, and there's going to be very little you can do to stop that as the dwarves. But if you're playing against a player who's using standard flying units or large units, stuff like this, you're going to have some defense against it. I'm not saying that this all of a sudden makes the dwarves an impenetrable nightmare, but this is a nice way to play the dwarves. And there's one little trick up his sleeve that the dwarf player has here with his lord, which is right here. This is a standard dwarf lord. And he's got the Fiery Ring of Thori, which you don't see used a lot, but basically it is a breath spell that becomes available to the dwarf leader. Now the Vargeist are kind of holding their distance. You'll see again the dwarf player is using his reserve units to make sure there's no clear path into his flanks. He's put some Longbeards in the very front because they have nice durability. And then he's got some dwarf warriors for the other part of his main front. And you can see his Thunderers have been firing away through these gaps and getting a lot of kills. Thunderers are a solid choice. They cause a lot of damage really quick, and you can see that his cannons and his Thunderers can continue to fire at the Crypt Horrors despite there already being an engagement because the Crypt Horrors are so tall. So by keeping these units back, again, let's take a quick look. Here comes the Fiery Ring of Thori too. I'm going to want you to see that. So this is another quite a brilliant moment, really. Like I said, the vampire player is just coming headlong in. He's not doing a whole lot of thinking here. But again, I want to give kudos to the way that the dwarf player is playing this. His cannons are defended here in the center. They're putting a massive smackdown on the Crypt Horrors here, and they've done a lot of damage to the White King. And again, you'll see the firing angle. The two Thunderers now have a firing angle, and they're focus firing this Crypt Horror. They're going to get it off the battlefield very quickly before it can cause as much damage as it's typically capable of. The Dwarf Lord comes in here to help out as well. But notice as he comes up here and gets into this combat, it leaves a nice angle. He can drop that Fiery Ring of Thori now right through these units that are here in the center. One of these is a Skeleton Warrior, the other is a Crypt Horror, both of which are going to be fairly vulnerable to the Fiery Ring of Thori. Let's watch the effects. Comes right through the vampire units there. Gets a pretty good shot. It's not brilliant, but it does some decent damage. So again, I think that shot would have been a little bit better handled if it may have been dropped a little bit closer, but that may have been the best the Dwarf player could do. But still, the idea, again, the idea is correct. He got a few units bottled up. Like, I think right now would have been the better time to drop it because you had more units there. But it was still quite good. And again, you'll notice the positioning. Finally, the vampire is going to come in with the Vargeist, and he's going to try and silence the Thunders. You see the Thunders at this point are going to be attacked. But again, now the Dwarf player is just going to activate the reserves. So here comes the Slayers to pin down the Vargeist, and then here comes a Dwarf Warrior or Longbeard, again to pin down the Vargeist. And sometimes once you have pinned a unit like Vargeist, you can sometimes move your guys away. Now, the vampire player should be using Invocation in the hack. That's typically what a vampire player would be doing. He's using weird stuff. Like right now, I think he's using Curse of Years, which is not terrible. But against the Dwarfs, it's not really going to do a ton of good because they don't have a lot of melee attack to begin with. But, I mean, he should be using Invocation in the hack and possibly some other spells here to help him out. Look at the active reserves here. It was a miner with blasting charges, so he can bring it in to cause extra damage to the Vargeist. And this can also be used against cavalry that charges in, so it's a nice choice. You got the blasting charges in the back rather than the front line where you typically see them. And you've got the Slayers in here too, which were the anti-large component. They helped wipe out those Vargeists, and it kept his Thunderers alive, who are still going to remain in the fight. Here they are. So both his Thunderers escape with relatively minimal damage, and Thunderers in a late game scenario are a nightmare. If you don't have any way to get to them, they're very, very strong. So the cannons, he's now focused them in on the Necromancer, and the Necromancer is on a horse, and cannons tend to do extremely well versus large targets, and the cannons are going to absolutely wreck this Necromancer. He's not going to last long. The vampire player sees that he's being attacked, tries to get into combat, but again, it's the size of the unit model. There comes the Fiery Ring of Thori. Once again, a pretty nice shot. Did some decent damage. There's 32 kills on the Dwarf Lord. You can see that Master Necromancer is taking a shellacking. The cannons are back in a safe position now, as are the Thunders, and you can see that it's only now that we're into the late game that the Dwarf player is committing his final reserves, now that he's made sure his units are safe. You see how quickly they dropped the Master Necromancer there? So that's why you got to keep those Thunders protected. Like I said, now, don't get me wrong, the Vampires and the Empire, they can bring much worse flying contingents against the Dwarves, to the point where I really don't even think there's a good way to protect your stuff. But again, despite the way that the Vampire player picked or played here, I think there's some merit to the way that the Dwarf player chose to do things. He had a lot of infantry, which gave him multiple defensive positions. He has cost-effective artillery, which give him long range, forcing a player to come attack him. He had the Fiery Ring of Thori going on his leader here so that he could cause disruption elsewhere in an infantry fight, which again is going to be helpful. Interesting enough here, the only hero he had was the Dwarf Lord. Typically you see Thanes or Runesmiths mixed in. I still think that that could be a good idea if you could get the balancing right. I don't know if 2 cannons are necessary or not, but I mean, they got a lot of kills. They did good. They did every bit as much or more than what a Thane would do, so I'm not going to question his pick here. So I mean, it's an interesting setup that the Dwarfs had, and you can see he's going to win this battle very handily. The Dwarfs at this point are going to be quite capable of winning their fight. Now he's definitely causing some damage to his own men here, but when he's got this much of a convincing victory underway, he should be safe. The Cryptors here should be getting shot by the Thunders. There's the 3rd Fire Ring of Thori that hits the Cryptors, and they will be particularly vulnerable to that fire damage. The Dwarf player, like I said, should be firing over here on the Cryptors, but I mean, he's okay. Whatever he's clicked an attack order on, he doesn't have line of sight that are obstructed. Looks like he's repositioning now, but the fight's over. So a convincing win over that vampire army. Like I said, it wasn't the best vampire army, but I wanted to hit that because I wanted to hit the merits of what the dwarf player was doing there. The gaps in the line so that his thunderers could fire. The firing ring of Thori was pretty clever, where you can use your lord and shoot that down the side of an infantry engagement. The layers of reinforcements, so that if there was a cavalry charge, for instance, in the back, the slayers come to reinforce after the cavalry has been slowed down, after it's made its charge, so that they'll be more effective. And the cannons also can pick away at large mobile units before they get into combat. The front line is then supported by your thunders and all the infantry. So again, dwarves are still an underdog. Don't think that I'm trying to state anything to the opposite. I just, like I said, wanted to call this out because I thought that was worthwhile. Let's talk just briefly about some of the things the dwarfs have at their in their arsenal to defend against, like, YOLO charges from flying units, and it is limited. If you think about what they have that they can use against large units, it's mostly just these expensive units like slayers. Longbeards with great weapons do armor-piercing damage, and they can be decentish if they don't get charged by cavalry at getting in and causing a lot of damage to cavalry, because cavalry tends to have a lot of armor. So, like, for instance, we go to the vampire counts and we look at the Blood Knight. The Blood Knight has 110 armor. If you go over to the Empire and you take a look even at, like, a cheap Empire Knight, it's 100 armor. So remember, cavalry units come heavily armored. So units like these are good as a reserve unit. They can still die heftily from the charge, and if you look at these guys, they don't have a charge defense against large, and that's kind of a problem, which means that they're gonna die terribly. And it's the same thing with the slayers. They have this is the only anti-large unit besides a cannon at the arsenal of the dwarves. So again, that's why I like how the dwarf player kept this in the middle where it's not going to get charged. If you do look at some other options, though, dwarf warriors have charge defense against large, longbeards have charge defense against large, hammerers do not. So just kind of keep that in mind. The great weapons variants of units tend to not have charge defense against large. Ironbreakers have charge defense against all. Now, when it comes to killing monsters and stuff like that, the Trollhammer Torpedo is extremely good at killing monsters. It's very powerful, but it's very expensive. This unit is very flimsy and very easy to kill. It has a lot of armor, but it's still extremely vulnerable to skirmishers, and it's still going to be extremely vulnerable to flying units, and if a cavalry unit gets it, it's over. So if you can get hits with this on an enemy lord or hero or monster or whatever it is, it will wreck it. Very, very powerful, but it is an insane risk, and you're not going to see it used very often. Thunders are probably the most reliable, and probably the easier to keep safe because they're a decent melee combatant. The price of them is not as foreboding as this either. Cannons are usually a solid choice because of the anti-large and the relatively fair price to the long range. So, I mean, in terms of how you can stop being just crazy charged like that, you can't, but you can try and be prepared for it. If you have a couple of cannons, a couple of thunders, and all this other stuff, the enemy player is going to have to choose where to come down and how to attack those. And if they do too much at once, you may be able to overwhelm them with your reserves. The binders with blasting charges were a good choice because these guys can cause a lot of damage to a unit once it gets fixed in combat. So the way these were kept in reserve, again, is nice. They're not a great frontline infantry unit, and most of the time players will let them throw their charges and then just get eaten up. Definitely better to keep them in reserve, let them throw that charge at a cavalry unit or something that's coming in. They can also be charge bait. If they get charged by the cavalry, then the nearby slayers or longbeards with great weapons can then engage after that charge where they will have been kept safe. So definitely that's going to be your options. It's not going to be easy. You're going to be the underdog. Hope this helps you out, though. Tell me what you do as the dwarves to try and keep them protected. Hope you enjoyed the video. Appreciate MSI having sponsored this build that I'm recording this with. Appreciate you, my awesome viewer. If you wish to subscribe, there's a logo down in the bottom right-hand corner where you can do so. If not, then hey, I still appreciate you watching, and please stick around. I'll see you on the next video. HeirofCarthage, signing out.